Welcome to Catholic Conversations. This is your host, Adrian Fonseca. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the War of the Vendée, which is a war in the French Revolution about these Catholics, the Vendée, who fought against the French Revolution and the destruction of scepter and cross. The person I'm interviewing today is Mr. Aquila. He got his bachelor's in history and did his bachelor's thesis on the French Revolution. So I'll be talking to him about this. And he wanted me to let you know that there's an email that if you had any other further questions and comments, you could feel free to email him here. Um, but the but before yeah, so this intro is being recorded at a later date, so which is why I have that information. He said to give you the email Aquila.Dominick at gmail.com. Aquila, Aquila dot Dominick, DOMINICK at gmail.com. I'll include it down below in the description. So feel free to email him there. Other than that, the other thing is we're going to start off with a overview of the French Revolution, and then we'll get into the stories of the Vendée. And then we'll conclude with talking about the Song of Fidelity, which I will include the Song of Fidelity at the end of this episode. And then I'll leave a link so you can go see the original video by the TFP of the Song of Fidelity. Without further ado, I'm going to throw you into the episode. And you'll hear a second introduction because I did an introduction whenever I recorded it originally, so you'll get two introductions today. Okay, without further ado, here you go. Welcome to Catholic Conversations. This is your host, Adrian Fonseca, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the French Revolution, and in very particularly, we're going to be talking about the War of the Vendée, which I've been pronouncing Vendée for like forever, and so I just found out how to pronounce it correctly. Hopefully, I don't know if I'm doing this right. I'm going to be butchering French names left and right, so just wanted to throw that out there for the beginning. And I'm going to be interviewing Mr. Dominick Aquila. He did his bachelor's thesis on the French Revolution and had a focus of European history in his bachelor studies. So we'll be talking about the French Revolution with a particular focus on the War of the Vendée, and we'll talk about that right now. But first, I want to introduce Mr. Dominick Aquila. Hi, Dominick.
Hey, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for being on with me. And so first I want to introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to interest in French history, this kind of, or European history, and even.
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in history, even from a young age. I remember reading books, and my dad studied history, and so I was always asking him questions. But found, when I went to public school for several years, I was primarily homeschooled, but for several years I was in public school, and so exposed to those textbooks, and then kind of contrasted with some of the Catholic textbooks, which both had a pretty clear bias. But it intrigued me the stories about people, and getting to know people, both the familiarity or similarity from all walks of history to today, but also the vast differences, and so it always kind of fascinated me. And so then in college, I majored in history, and just kind of as I was able, tailored my class load to early modern history, where I found that European history, which would be roughly 1500 through 1900. So that period I found very fascinating, since it's a very dynamic and changing period of Western history in the world. And I think we're still kind of seeing the effects of that period unfolding in our culture today. So, but of course, I got interested. Actually, kind of started when I started reading the Master and Commander novels by Patrick O'Brian, which is about the sort of the naval war from the British perspective. But I started reading all kinds of novels about the period, and that was in high school. And then so that led to an interest to learn more about the political philosophy ideas, the events, just so much that happens in the French Revolution. And so that period very fascinated me.
Very interesting. I actually, for people who have listened for a while and for new listeners, I actually interviewed Mr. Aquila's brother on an earlier episode, and like maybe episode 8, and this is like episode 57 at this point, on politics. So the Aquilas are quite diverse in their fields of study, and I used to help run another podcast with someone else, and we interviewed Mr. Aquila's father, Dr. Aquila, on Dante and a number of things like that. So the Aquilas are just very talented people, very smart people to talk to. So but absolutely, I'm very excited to talk about this, because I honestly, I've never really, we briefly talked about the French Revolution, and mostly in the context of it relating to the American Revolution back when I was in school. And so when I was reading to prepare for this podcast, I was reading through the New Advent Encyclopedia on the French Revolution, and then I read through just Wikipedia on the French Revolution, and then a couple other things. And I'm just like, what? I did not realize just how many things were going on at the same time during the French Revolution. It was so many things. Thought I was going to be able to, just get a cursory look all at once. And it was just like, there's this political party, and there's that political party, and then there's this revolution, while there's another revolution going on at the same exact time. And it's very chaotic. Can you give me a brief overview of like, what am I reading? What is going on right now?
Yeah, so I mean, the French Revolution is just vastly more complex than the American Revolution. In terms of the movements and the ideas and the direction it's moving. I mean, on my bookshelf right here in front of me, there's a book called "The Thermidorians and the Directory," which is a period of about maybe 2 years in the early days of the French Revolution. But there's an entire book just on that, year and a half to 2 year period, because there's so much happening. So the French Revolution really is considered starting in 1789, when prior to this, of course, it really, you kind of see some of the initial setup happening under Louis XIV, where he is one of the first absolute monarchs of Europe, where he essentially is trying to bypass the nobles.
Okay, can we we'll pause right there for a second.
Sorry,
when you say absolute monarch, so from an American mindset, most people tend to think monarchs and only have an idea of what an absolute monarch. So can you make a distinction between an absolute monarch and a other kind of monarch?
So before the 1600s in Europe, the kings and queens of Europe they did not have absolute power. Their authority was checked by the church, by the noblemen, and by tradition and custom within each kingdom. So the king was by no means unlimited, both from a practical standpoint of he did not have the ability really to control every region of the country or a kingdom, but also by the fact that the power was always divided amongst the local noblemen. With Louis the 14th, what he does is he builds Versailles, which is intended largely to be sort of an entertainment park or complex for the noblemen. So, and he builds it so it's just far enough away from Paris that it's inconvenient for the noblemen to ride to Paris to help administer the government. So he keeps them distracted in Versailles and puts in place bureaucrats to help him sort of consolidate power throughout the kingdom. And so essentially this leads to a strong consolidation and centralization of power within France over the next roughly 100, 150 years. So when we reach 1789, France has been in this sort of absolutist mentality or structure for a while. And then, in the 1760s and 70s, France gets into a series of wars with Britain, including the American Revolution, and which virtually bankrupts France. And at the same time, famine strikes. And so there's, bad crop, bizarre weather patterns occurring. And so France's people are in a state of unrest. Add to that the sort of development of Enlightenment ideals and objectives, sort of the dominance of reason.
Mm-hmm.
And
I always found it quite interesting how they call it the Enlightenment, and it made me think of immediately of Satan, who was Lucifer, the light bearer, and what else is enlightenment but bearing the light, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that kind of that little connection, and I'm sure they weren't thinking that when they did, or maybe they were thinking that
No, I mean there
with their
were.
goddess of reason.
Yeah, I mean they do. Yeah, there is the goddess of reason, but they also they use kind of that, even they tended to use more the Greek and Roman imagery, but
Mm,
that idea of stealing the light from the gods, and
mm.
and there is oftentimes sort of a subtle kind of setting up of an opposition between reason and faith, or reason and God, and church and religion. So that's very much present there.
It's kind of interesting because I grew up learning about the French Revolution. I went to a Catholic school my whole life, pretty much. I went to a public school for like kindergarten through fourth grade, so don't even
Yeah.
remember that much. But in history class, I remember learning about the French Revolution as a good thing, as things that were like,
Hmm.
oh, we've thrown off the shackles of superstition and have
Right.
taken on this new enlightenment where we are now using reason, whereas before we weren't. Could you speak a little bit about that in relation to the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's a very common theme, and that's that kind of view of both the French Revolution, and even to some regard the American Revolution, is kind of projected back onto that. Um, but it was obviously there in those Enlightenment ideas, these ideals that if we take off the restraints that limit human actions in our countries, our kingdoms, if they are free, if they have liberty, then man will just magically, almost depending on who you're reading, some of the writers are like, man is still needs a lot of guidance. Others are like, and all of mankind will just flourish and everything will be wonderful, and we'll end up in a kind of a.
So we just lost your audio for a second. I think your Zoom froze or Wi-Fi connection, and so it's just kind of interesting. I'm gonna just say a few things while connection gets back, and then I'll have you get back and say that again. But yeah, so the French Revolution during this the Enlightenment time was period where a lot of things were just chaotic, and so many people just kind of thought that there was just that the church was oppressing reason,
Right.
and that without it, if we got rid of the church, we got rid of faith, then we would be able to have our full potential realized. But that I mean, it just seems it's where we get kind of the myth of the Dark Ages of
Right.
Thomas Aquinas was living during the Dark Ages, and so these were it's kind of absurd once you actually look at the thinkers who are alive during these so-called Dark Ages.
Right.
But yeah, so as you were saying,
Yeah, yeah, no, it's just, and the term "the Dark Ages" always drives me nuts because, yeah, if there was any Dark Ages, it was probably like the 50 years immediately after the fall of Rome, where Europe
Mm.
was actually in chaos. But anyway, that's a different rant. So, but yeah, the Enlightenment ideas, they view the church as just being oppressive. They view the kings as being oppressive, and so that we just need to remove the oppression of religion, and then people will be able to think freely, and and bring wonderful things to fruition in society. Basically,
Mm.
if we just kind of organize everything just the right way, we'll be fine. So
So fast forwarding to the War of the Vendée, since leading going through all the things leading up to that would probably take a few novels or a few books. So skipping ahead, can you give us the context of the War of the Vendée? I was reading how it was related to a lot of. Oh, okay. So here's another good question that I didn't know the answer to until a couple of days ago. I was looking it up, and I never, for some reason, I never asked why Saint John Vianney was called the Cure of Ars.
mhm.
I was like, and I just didn't know what cure meant, but I just figured, didn't look it up. So can you explain like what is a cure?
The curé was is basically a French priest, and was in charge of sort of a pastor, and in charge of kind of a local area, essentially. So the
Okay,
cures were basically, it's just another kind of a French title. Um,
and so
that Yeah.
when I was reading about it, they were talking about how um, preceding the War of the Vendée, there was a period where they were like oppressing the cures,
Mhm.
and they were forcing them to take oaths of fidelity to the state, and all these different things, and they're going, and if they did not, they would be I forgot what the punishment was, but there's this whole thing that was going on before leading up to the actual War of the Vendée. And could you inform me about that?
Yeah, so kind of a quick summary. I would say the major things that led up to it were the Civil Constitution on the Clergy, which was published in 1790, which demanded that all the clergy in France basically swear an oath of allegiance to the state, and that all matters regarding the church were to be governed by the state. So most of the bishops did not take this oath. About half of the priests waited, and then about half of them did take the oath initially, but the other half were waiting to hear from the Pope. So the Pope does condemn this constitution, but essentially what it does is that any priest who did not take the oath was forbidden from preaching publicly, and that was initially the first kind of punishment. And they're forbidden to perform any public rites such as weddings and baptisms. The other things that were kind of initially sort of the immediately prior to the Vendéan uprising was the execution of King Louis XVI in January of 1793.
Who was King Louis XVI?
Yeah, King Louis XVI. So he was the king of France at that time. He was the one who kind of he was trying to reform things, but it got out of control. He was a very pious and some would say even holy man, but he was not a very effective king or administrator or ruler of the state. And so he started this process that just got seriously out of hand, and then ends up with once the radicals kind of take control of the revolution in 1792. It leads to his execution, his removal from the kingship, the throne. He's put on trial and executed in January of 1793. And so then a few months later, the radical elements of the revolutionary government, which the government is a hot mess. No one's entirely sure who's in charge of what. You've got the mob of Paris influencing part of the government. You've got this committee of radical politicians, and then you've got the military, and so there's all these different moving pieces.
And so in the two political parties, was that the Jacobins or Jacobins?
Yeah,
and the Jacobins. Okay, that's how you say that. The Jacobins and the what was the other group that was there as well?
Girondins. Girondins, because the representatives came from Gironde, France.
Okay. But the Vendée were not associated with either. Is that correct? Or were they associated with the Jacobins?
So the political parties were very kind of loose. They're more political clubs that kind of grew out of the political salons, which were gathering places, social gathering places for people to talk about political ideas. And so like the Girondins was like a faction, the Jacobins, later the Thermidorians, and all kinds of different groups kind of ebb and flow throughout this time.
Okay.
So
that's interesting. Okay, and so back to you were saying that leading up to it, the last thing you said was the King Louis the 15th, 16th. Okay,
yeah,
was just executed.
Yeah. So some of the radicals say that he has committed crimes against the people, and so they call for his execution on the scaffold. Before he's guillotined, he actually states his forgiveness, forgive the people for what they're doing. And he tries to speak to them, but they drown him out with the drums, and then he loses his head, all too literally. Yeah. So, and then around the same time, they're increasing taxation across the country, because in their revolutionary fervor, they've decided that they're going to bring the revolution to every country, every kingdom across the whole world. And so they declare war on the Austrians. But this war is intended to bring peace to the world, so it's okay. After they declare war, they're like, oh, we need soldiers. So they basically implement what's called conscription, which is effectively a draft. And so they're trying to gather an army of 300,000 men from across France. And so, and then in March they end up closing all Catholic churches
Wow.
to worship and deny
In
any
March, you
public.
said?
March of 1793. Yeah.
Kind of like March of 2020.
Yeah, eerily similar some ways, but so all these kind of big things all come together, and the Vendeans are a very rural people. They're the noblemen hadn't moved off to Paris. They had stayed and lived locally, and so they were much closer to their people and to the lands they were in charge of than many of the other noblemen across France.
So they kind of had kept to a principle of subsidiarity.
Yeah, like those Catholic ideas, sort of that you could see more the ideal of feudal society actually being played out there more, where you have a relationship between your lord and your people, and that there's a sense of loyalty, duty, protection, and service to one another. Of course, that was sort of the ideal, but in the Vendée, we kind of actually see that happening more. There's a very strong Catholic faith and very devout throughout the region. And so even from the start of the revolution, they were like, not really sure what's happening over there in Paris, but it's not affecting us too much, so we'll just keep doing our thing. But then all this other stuff happens leading up, and then they're like, they get pretty fed up. So.
Okay, it's very interesting. So it kind of seems to me that it was kind of, and this is kind of, I guess, a simplistic way of looking at it, but in my mind, I'm kind of seeing it as almost like America used to be, where we had state rights, and every state kind of, if California is doing this thing, whatever, I'm going to be in Texas. So they do their thing and we do our thing. So it seemed kind of like the Vendée, where like, our where we're at, things are good, things are fine, and I'm just going to let them play out how it goes. But then things start affecting them directly, and so they need to rise up to defend their country rather than their small place. So like if there was a revolutionary, or if there's a war in America, I could stay in Texas and defend Texas. But then once it starts affecting us, then it's time to go out of Texas and start defending the nation as a whole.
Right.
The kind of right way of looking at.
Yeah, it is largely comparable. Like that in early American history, most people's allegiance was primarily to their state or to their local region, and that kind of came before the country or the nation. And so the French revolutionaries are big on this idea of nation. In the Declaration of the Rights of Man, they talk about how all sovereignty derives from the nation, whatever that is. It's not at all defined, and so but this sort of a theoretical idea of the nation as some kind of united, almost metaphysical reality. That's and it's really this kind of thinking that allows for these modern type of thinking that really allows for racism and genocide in the way that we have experienced in the last couple hundred years. Is this idea of embodying a nation as an identity that is distinct, but also capable, even in theory, of being superior to someone else or to some other group.
That's very interesting. There's a lot of threads there that I want to pick up.
Yeah.
But
I know. Sorry, there's a.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm trying to decide if I want to pick up one of those threads or go back to the Vendée. I think we're going to go back to the Vendée, but that's really interesting. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man have me thinking about a lot of things, but I'm not going to bring them up because then I'm going to go way off topic.
Write them down for later. We can have a conversation, record it or not. I'd love to talk.
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
talking about
That's
this
very
stuff.
interesting.
So, yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
So the Vendée, let's go back there. So at this point, they are so now they have decided that something's going on. What happens next? Do they how does a group of people just get up as a monolith? Like how does this happen? Because it seems to me like I was thinking about this because I've been thinking about the Vendée a lot the last couple of days preparing, and I was driving home today from Mass, and I was thinking, if something like this happened in America, and I decided to go out there and fight for God and country, I don't think anybody would come behind me. I'd be going out alone. I'd die alone because I don't think anybody would get up behind me. How does one gather how does this happen? Was there a leader? Was there a strong pool of people? How did this happen?
Well, it kind of started with the people first, because so it really what's sort of considered to be the ultimate spark is the attempt to recruit men from Vendée for the army, and it was that's sort of the context, the physical context. Basically, the recruitment officers come through parts of the Vendée region and try to get their quota of men, and the people aren't having it, and so they basically start kind of rioting specifically against those recruitment officers. But then soon it kind of expands to the local, National Guard unit, and ransacking the Republican, which is the revolutionary government, the Republican leaders and administrators from Paris in the region. And so basically just, a bunch of peasants with pitchforks and that kind of thing. It starts out that way. And then within a couple of weeks, they go seek out some of the noblemen who have military experience and ask them to lead. And one of those is the gentleman you were talking about, Henri de la Roche-Jacqueline. Did my best to say that name. It's a mouthful. Who was a young noble. He's only about 20 years old. A young noble at the time, but he helps to lead one of the smaller groups, and then eventually takes over when the initial general dies in battle. But so yeah, it kind of started like very spontaneously, and they just were trying to riot against the conscription, and then all of a sudden they realized we can accomplish something. And so in those initial riots, there is some brutality and some violence that's pretty atrocious on the Vendéans' part. But it was this, not to justify, but to put it in perspective, it was there was a initial riot that ended up with a couple hundred people killed. But after that, more or less, the Vendéan army kind of organized itself, and actually started accomplishing more military goals.
See, that's interesting that you bring that up, because it's interesting to think about how when there is chaos, it necessarily ends up bad against God, because chaos is necessarily against God. But whenever there's order, order is directed towards God. It is, well, not is God, but it's a different. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah.
But and so it's good to see that, like the Vendée, when in chaos, there's the bad things happen. But when there's right order to it and a right end, when they realize what their end is and not just I'm going to go out there and riot, then things start looking up. Good things start happening.
Exactly, which is a contrast. It's interesting because I was reading, kind of refreshing my memory about all this, and I was reading about what's called the September massacres. And just a very brief comparison: the September massacres, there's the mob is wanting to punish perceived enemies of the revolution, and so they kind of take over a cart full of prisoners and pull them into a marketplace, put them on trial, and then summarily execute them, hacking them apart, beating them to death.
Wow.
And so the way that gets organized or ordered is basically the city government of Paris is like, well, we don't want this to go crazy, so let's organize the tribunal and executions. So the tribunal and essentially murder doesn't stop; it just gets organized. But in the Vendée, I would argue that more so the leadership and the organization led to, like you said, a clear goal. And then it solidifies around this identity as the army, the Grand Army, Catholic and Royal Army of the Vendée. And so it has a more intentional focus.
Right. I guess there needs to be a distinction there then, because like I'm thinking when you say that, I'm thinking the systematic execution of people by Nazi Germany or the Soviet Russia. They were very organized. But I think we had to make a distinction between being organized and having proper order.
Yeah.
And so, definitely, that's a good point, because, I definitely having an organized evil is much worse.
Yes, exactly. Which we, if we get to it, like the aftermath of the Vendée Revolt is frighteningly, evocative of that kind of organized, just horror.
Mm.
So,
and so how does the Sacred Heart of Jesus play in? Because when I look at the pictures of the Vendée, they always have a patch on their chest of the Sacred Heart. How does that get to become a symbol of the Vendée?
So, like I said, it's a strongly Catholic region of France, and they're very devout. And of course, the devotion of the Sacred Heart of Mary, Sacred Heart of Jesus, Immaculate Heart of Mary, Sacred Heart of Jesus, was sort of visions and promulgated by Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, who is French, and so the relationship with Catholics and the Sacred Heart in France is very, very strong there. There are several cathedrals called the Sacré-Cœur, which is the Sacred Heart. And so it's rich in that the devotional tradition of France. And so then when this revolution takes on this Catholic nature or identity, is the Catholic and then later royal army of the Vendée. They chose sometimes some of their banners had like the Immaculate Heart of Mary on it, but then they chose a very simple design of the Sacred Heart with a cross above it. As an expression of their faith and their invoking the intercession of the Sacred Heart, and that their aim or their goal is entrusted to the care of the Sacred Heart.
It's very interesting. The French, the France as a country is typically referred to as the eldest daughter of the church, and it's interesting to think about because I did a few podcasts on the miraculous medal and the green scapular, and I'd never realized like there's so many things have happened to France, and just like Our Lady blessed France so much, giving them the miraculous medal, giving them the green scapular. Notre Dame, which built by the hands of the French, along with apparently the Sacred Heart of Jesus as well, and Our Lady of Lourdes in Lourdes, France. Our Lady has blessed France so much, and the betrayal against the church is just it's so deep cutting, and I guess that's something that Satan does. Like he wants to tear down the greatest, because the greater the fall, the greater the failure, right? So what is the I forget it in Latin. The greatest it becomes the worst.
I've heard the phrase. I don't remember the Latin though.
But that's it. So I think I just kind of when you were saying how that apparition of Saint Mary Alacoque, and that of the Sacred Heart, and it just blows my mind how blessed France was, and yet they fell so far. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true. It's crazy, and it's my wife and I, when we got married, we decided that as we were learning about the devotion to the Sacred Heart, we wanted to enshrine that in our lives and invoked it as a protection of our family. And so we did what's called a home enthronement of the Sacred Heart. And we had a priest over and bless our apartment and bless the images of the Sacred Heart. But it's basically dedicating our lives to the Sacred Heart. And so it's been a powerful invocation to have in our lives and for many others. And so I think it has this very powerful pull in the minds of the French people. So
absolutely. Yeah. And you're not even French, you're Italian.
Yeah, exactly.
It just shows that other people can do it too.
Yep,
but yeah,
exactly.
so the going back to the battles, you said that once they kind of got organized, they actually started realizing that they could win. They were winning some battles. Tell me about that.
The first several months, so initially they were basically peasants armed. They had a couple hunting rifles, but mostly size, farming size and pitchforks and that kind of thing. But they actually were doing well, partly because the revolutionaries in Paris, there were riots all over France in response to the revolution, or the taxation or the conscription, all those kinds of things. So, but the revolutionaries in Paris were like, well, this Vendée thing that's going to blow over. It's isolated, not a big deal. But so they didn't really dedicate a lot of troops or organization to it. But the Vendéan army eventually grows to somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men and women who fought actually a number.
Really?
Yeah, a number of women I was reading, particularly they would help with the cannons and supplying and caring for the soldiers, because these were
Wow.
people who just lived nearby. And it was kind of funny. I read that oftentimes after a battle, they would go home for a while and tend to their farms, and then come back and fight for the next battle, kind of thing. So, but it was very much a communal effort. But anyway, so the army, they end up defeating a few detachments of the Republican soldiers, and are able to gather some more gunpowder and munitions and cannons and that kind of thing. And so they even take, I think it's I remember. So they take several major cities. Angers is one, I think, and then they kind of reach their peak as they're trying to take Nantes, which is one of the largest cities in France. They're not very organized still, but they end up losing this battle at Nantes, and that kind of marks the decline of the
Mm.
major military efforts. And all of this takes place roughly between March and December of 1793, the significant portion of the fighting. And so basically after that, the revolutionary government decides to send somewhere in the neighborhood of like 115,000 soldiers into the Vendée region. And they kind of hunt down the army and kind of slowly, through a series of battles, defeat it. And then finally, at Le Mans, there is a battle. The Vendéans are defeated, but the Republicans don't give any quarter, meaning that they take no prisoners.
Oh,
And
wow.
so something like 2,000, I think I've seen reported, around 2,000 prisoners were just summarily executed.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was just the beginning of the horrible retribution that was inflicted on the Vendée. In recent years, there's been some movements to label it an explicit genocide. I don't know that it necessarily meets the criteria for that, but
Right, because they
it
were armed.
was. Mhm.
Yeah.
And so like genocide has to do with the explicit intention of exterminating the entirety of a race. And so if Vendéans left Vendée, they weren't bothered, kind of thing. So there's some technical understanding, but my point being is that people have invoked that term because what came after the actual end of the military conflict was just utterly horrifying.
So the Vendée, and if I'm understanding correctly, it seemed to me that the Vendée would have been more successful if they hadn't been normal people having to go home and take care of their families, tend to their farms, and that they were having to live basically double lives
Right.
in this kind of way. And that once they lost a major battle, I mean, they're not soldiers. At least
Right.
majority of them are not. You lose a major battle, you lose so many of and it's not just like losing your men; it's losing
Right.
your neighbors, losing your
Right.
brothers and your uncle and your cousins. And that's a huge blow to your morale. Speaking, and you said that there was what came after.
Yeah. So, and just a brief note too, they did try to hook up with British forces, but the British forces never made it there in time, and so there was an attempt to kind of expand, but it never came to fruition. Now there was a lot of guerrilla warfare throughout the region, on and off, during this 1793, but even sporadically for almost the next decade. There was unrest and difficulty there throughout. So. But after the military defeat and the end, and around December of 1793, comes just the horror of they're called the infernal columns. And there's this general of the Republic, named Turreau, whose name is on the Arc of Triumph, and who lived a happy life afterwards, but he there never came to any punishment. But he, with very kind of loose or general authorization from the revolutionary government, is sort of tasked with, burning the Vendée to the ground. And reading some of the descriptions from the Republican troops is utterly horrifying. And they they justify it with this, it was necessary for the peace and stability of the republic and our country, the usual kind of stuff, or this is what we were ordered to do, um, which is that same mentality that is so frightening, and leads to other genocides. But essentially, what it is he sends these columns of 3 to 5,000 troops each, kind of crisscrossing across the Vendée region, almost in like grid formation to make sure that it's very thorough. And everywhere they go, they burn everything they find and kill virtually, almost literally every single person they come into contact with. They estimate at least 50,000 people were killed over the course of several months. Um, some estimates range over 100,000, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly. But they burn and just kill and pillage and rape and murder. There are vivid descriptions written down. Like I said, a lot of them from even the Republican, people who were the more literate of the two groups. And even their accounts are just like, this is horrifying. This is,
Wow.
But they justify it by this sort of Enlightenment mentality of, we must do this so that we can survive. And if we let them live, somehow we have lost. It isn't victory unless the enemy is exterminated, essentially.
So kind of like the modern war theory of like total victory.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of my favorite books is actually called the First Total War.
Oh.
And it's written by, he's a secular historian, but he's very, very fair and balanced, I find. And he has a whole section dedicated to the Vendée because he sees it as the embodiment of these principles of total war, which for practical reasons were never really carried out. Like, you don't see the French massacring British prisoners because they know that the British will then respond by massacring French prisoners. So but with the Vendée, they don't have to worry about retribution.
Right.
And so they go through, one of the most infamous accounts is along the River Loire. I'm trying to remember the name of the town. I'll have to try to remember it, but they can't kill the Vendéan rebels fast enough. The firing squads cost, it's spending, we're using too much gunpowder and bullets. The guillotine, there's too much blood. It's nauseating the population. Dull. Yeah, exactly. Got to sharpen it. It's so tedious. But which essentially, that there were people who were like, this isn't, we can't do it.
This isn't efficient.
Exactly.
We need gas chambers.
No, you say that, but there was actually some who proposed developing some kind of gas to put into, like, poison, poisons or poison gases to either use to put in the soil to, totally destroy the land and kill the people, or to poison the alcohol that was being shipped into the region, that kind of thing.
Wow.
So it was,
oh my gosh.
Now those things didn't come to fruition, but what did happen is that several thousand, Vendéans were tied up and, tied hand and foot and put in these barges and boats and brought out into the river. And then they were either set on fire or used cannon shot to shoot them and sink them in the river, so that they could kill people more efficiently, essentially.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And not in a good way.
No.
Yeah. So with trying to make connections with, because the reason why I was so curious about the War of the Vendée recently and the French Revolution is because it seems like a lot of the principles of the French Revolution are being brought to fruition in America today. And with this destruction of the statues of Saint Junipero Serra, of Christopher Columbus, of the threatening of the destruction of Saint Louis, of the threatening of the destruction of the Cathedral of St. Louis in St. Louis, Missouri, the renaming of anything Catholic, it seems as though that these same principles are being applied to today, and that we're heading in that kind of direction. And I was wondering if you have any comments on seeing like parallels to today.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are, as with most popular kind of uprisings or revolts, and we definitely see. So I just want to quote from the Declaration of Rights of Man, which the revolutionary government promulgated in 1789. Paragraph 4 quote begins, Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. And that, to me, just embodies the modern American, sort of leftist principle, just, wholeheartedly. That could basically be their motto.
Right. It's basically like radical libertarianism.
Right. It's I can do whatever I want, and the only limit on my behavior is that I cannot limit your behavior. So if my whatever I feel like doing is harmful to you or injures you, then I can't do it. But that's essentially the only limit.
But effectively, that's untrue, though, because one man's freedom is another man's slavery. And so you kind of end up having to choose, what freedoms do we want? If we want everybody to be able to get married to whoever you want, then we're going to have to oppress the church. Right.
Exactly. Quell the church. Yeah. And so there are parallels. And, in terms of like the sort of the riots and the unrest it's so frustrating. As with the initial riots of the French Revolution, is that there were legitimate issues. There were authentic issues and grievances to be held against the government and against the society at large. But so quickly it got distorted, and it became this larger agenda to just radically change and tear down everything. And we could see the effect of that. There has not yet been a revolution that has torn everything down that has thrived or produced a flowering thing. It created anything. Like a destructive movement is always going to destroy. And so I've been praying and craving for solid leadership in the current riots, so that can lead the people towards the actually accomplishing and attaining those things that are legitimate, and quelling and calming down sort of the radical things that lashing out at Catholics and statues are just unreasonable.
Yeah, I find it's very curious because the way we look at the world today, especially from a Catholic point of view, and seeing these things, I just don't see something like a group of Catholics, like the Vendée, rising up to the occasion. It seems as though we're all very timid. We're all very to hide up in my little hole and don't mess with me. And even if you do mess with me, well, then I'll just roll over and I'll just do something else.
Right, and I'll sue you. And I will say part of that is kind of a Catholic principle that we don't fight unless we absolutely have to. But we are also, when we have a duty to defend. And so I think, seeing some of the groups that were defending the statue of St. Louis was a bold example of being both principled and Catholic and defending in an appropriate way what we need to do. Because, like you said, I do think that, God forbid that, such an uprising be necessary, but at the same time, you would hope that people would be willing to fight for those important things.
Mm-hmm. What was the role of the clergy during the Vendée? Because it seems though there's just so few clergy today that are willing to lead because for me personally, if my pastor or my bishop called me to do something, I would go and do it. But if I'm expecting, like if they're threatening to destroy the statue of Christopher Columbus in Houston, which they ended up chopping his hand off, I'm not going to go out there on my own. I'm going to die.
Right.
But if my bishop says, hey, Catholic men of Houston, go out there and defend these Catholic statues, I'd be out there because I'd be confident that people would respond to the call.
Right.
But if I just post on Facebook, exactly, come and meet me there, guys, we're going to defend it. I don't think anybody would come and listen to me. I don't think I'm nobody. No one's listening to me.
Right.
So was there any kind of clerical leadership during this time?
There was some. There was one of the abbeys. I think it's which is like the French term for abbot. I think was pretty prominent. his name is escaping me now, but he was fairly prominent in the Vendée, and then later under Napoleon was actually important in bringing together a peace treaty between the Pope and France. But but so there were a number of clergy that were present. Some were present on the battlefields. You know, there's a lot of mythology on the Catholic end that comes out of Vendée, which is sort of a normal, kind of remembering of things. That kind of says the clergy were there on the front lines like all the time and that kind of thing. And that's a little bit exaggerated, but the clergy, obviously leading up to things, were pretty vocal about protesting and encouraging the people to not tolerate sort of the anti-church and anti-Catholic sentiments of the revolution. And I think that kind of emboldened the people. And obviously, there were chaplains and there were bishops and present that oftentimes, would give the soldiers absolution before a battle. And so they were definitely present and encouraged. And I think it was probably through their encouragement that they ended up using the symbols like the Sacred Heart, which oftentimes has been the effect of clergy is to temper the fervor of men in battle, which can quickly become very violent and uncontrolled. And so that there isn't a lot written specifically about what the clergy did, but it's clear that they were present and that they were supporting this movement pretty strongly.
Yeah, I was reading through some of the excerpts from the Song of Roland, and I was seeing how there was this bishop, I forget his name, but he was part of Charlemagne's generals. He was one of his generals, which I was like, there's a bishop who's a general in the what? And he was leading. And after Charlemagne went down, he started leading the army, and he gave a general absolution to all his men and said, for y'all's penance, strike the enemy cold. And then he rode into battle wielding a mace, because clergy couldn't wield a sword because you couldn't pierce someone's body, draw blood. And so he would wield a mace so he'd crush people. And I'm like, I don't see too many bishops today in the front lines leading us in battle, even just to the abortion clinic, or even just the closest thing I've seen has been, well, I guess now Archbishop Cordileone went out there. And then we've had Bishop Strickland go and pray outside abortion clinics. And so we have a couple now rising up. But it seems for so long and so many of our bishops are just, I don't want to say they don't care, but it seems as though they don't care.
Right. Bishops very easily get wrapped up in the busyness of administrating a giant, oftentimes giant diocese, archdiocese. For our example, in Galveston, Houston, it's like 1 million Catholics, 150 parishes, and we've got like 1.5 bishops. So it's I serve as an MC to Bishop Shelton, and he kind of jokes about it. Like, hit with his bad back, he's he's half retired, or certainly wants to be. So it is. You mentioned the soldier bishops. Just the other day, I ran across in one of the groups I follow. Someone shared an image of a military helmet that was mitered on the top. So it was this cavalry knight's helmet, but it was also mitered to let you know that it was a bishop who wore it.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. It just seems. It's so sad. I just wish that they were like, not even like my bar is so low today that I'm just like, y'all don't even have to go out there and lead us. Just tell us to do it. Right. Just tell us to go do something. Just say, hey, we want people to show up at X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to be able to be there because I got to be in my office. But I want people to be there.
Yeah. No, and
that's all I'm looking for.
That makes a significant difference. And I think they have more of a responsibility because, the bishops do have a certain degree of responsibility in the secular sphere and in the worldly sphere. They have not, they have not abrogated that authority. And so they do have the right, I think, and the authority to call the Catholics to action and a responsibility because they can do so in a way that's much more constructive and effective. And it is so much better to do things with the blessing of your bishop or your clergy than it is to do without. It legitimizes it. It helps maintain the goal, and and it helps prevent radicalism from setting in,
Right.
because it's
Right.
it's it's so important to not get caught up in saying
And
we have
even
to
just seeing
respond.
clergy makes you
Hmm.
just tempers you.
Exactly,
Because you're
exactly.
like when you think like it's kind of how like some people are like, would you say that in front of your mother?
Hmm.
Like, would you say that in front of a priest, or would you do that if your pastor was looking?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and so just by having the presence of a clergyman, it changes the atmosphere,
Right.
and that's just from a secular point of view. From a spiritual point of
Hmm.
view, even more so.
Yeah.
Um, whenever
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
yeah, I was listening to Jesse Romero talk about his experience with being at an exorcism, and he's like, whenever me and some of the other guys were all laymen chatting with a person who's they're about to have an exorcism on him, he's fine, everything's cool, we're just chatting, but then as soon as the priest walks in, the demon manifests, and because he just recognizes the authority of the priest, he just
Yeah.
immediately sees it, just understands who's in what place.
Yeah.
um, and so we kind of have demonized this idea of a clericalism, but clericalism per se, I don't think is a negative thing. I think it can be used for a negative, but I think there's something there, and that we don't have a problem of clericalism. We have a problem of lack of clericalism, really.
Yeah.
There's
Lack
no
of
respect for
proper clerics who are
Mhm.
called to be shepherds.
Right.
It's the shepherd is called to defend the flock. Christ constantly says that, and so you can't. The shepherd who leaves his flock is leaving it to the wolves. And so, yeah, priests and bishops especially do have a responsibility to properly shepherd the people, and to exercise that authority in a prudent way. And I think obviously the responsibility is on us lay people to do what we can when we can. But I agree that to me it shows the innate desire and need for leadership,
Mhm.
and it's not something that we can pretend doesn't matter, or isn't real. That's a sort of a dangerous idea that I think has started to creep into the church in many ways, is sort of this democratization of the church,
Mm. Yeah.
and and yeah, how the people are responsible for it, and the people are supposed to be out there in the world, and it's like, yes, we do live in the world, and we deserve and need the leadership of our shepherds.
Right. And it's kind of one of the reasons why we have secular priesthood.
Hmm.
And we have the bishops aren't part of orders anymore. If they become a bishop and they were in a religious order, say like a Dominican,
Hmm.
when they become a bishop, they no longer are a Dominican anymore. And they may retain obviously the spiritual patrimony of the Dominicans, but they become a secular priest. They become a bishop because they are leaders of the secular world and the spiritual world, of their jurisdiction. So yeah, I think yeah, that's just how it is. But last thing I want to say, the there's a song. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a song of the I think they call it the Song of Fidelity.
Le chant de
Um,
fidélité.
yeah, there you go. That's much better. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I heard that there was like two versions of the song, one by the French Republic, and then one that was kind of adapted for the Vendée. Um, are you
Yeah.
familiar with that?
So there's also, I know a little bit about the Song of Fidelity, but there's also one thing I was reading about too, is there's so that there's the French Marseillaise, which was written, as the dum bum 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 ba-dum. So that's kind of the
Mm.
French revolutionary anthem. But then the Vendéans kind of composed a counter one,
Mm.
which kind of has a very kind of a reverse kind of idea to it. So they were like those two main songs that the Vendéans sang a lot of times. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The Song of Fidelity I thought was really interesting because I feel as though it kind of encapsulates the entire story of the Vendée. Because I was thinking about it and it was like it talks about how they would leave hearth and home for the field, and
Hmm.
it really just it shows that these men were not simply just these guys who were soldiers going off to battle. Like they were men who had families that like they were not intending to be soldiers. They
Right.
were simply just regular guys wanting to stand up. In the opening of the song, it says they went off to fight for scepter and cross.
Hmm.
Um, And so that kind of idea of people wanting to go out and defend scepter and cross, especially scepter.
Right.
Like people just like automatically, especially from American standpoint, where we think kingdoms are evil, kings are bad. I can't imagine someone wanting to defend scepter and cross.
Right. Right.
Would you like to
Yeah.
comment on that?
Yeah, it's so true. There's we have the myth of in our country, it's the myth of the nation. We're here to defend liberty and freedom and rise up to defend that. I think historically people have always wanted to have been much more powerfully compelled by a person, and that's what's so crazy, just intensely kind of crazy about the Catholic faith, is that it is about an actual person of Christ.
Mm.
And so similarly, I think the king was seen as sort of an embodiment of the people. And so it's much easier to go fight for a person than it is for an idea. And so I think that, throughout history, there is that willingness, much more willingness to go and to stand up and to fight for those things. And when it is embodied, and it's always, even with the Crusades, many people were motivated by different religious things, but it took Bernard of Clairvaux standing up in front of people preaching and and exciting and leading these people to do it. And so I think that it's easier to defend a person, and the person of Christ and the person of the King than it is to want to go die for an idea that you may never see realized in any way, shape, or form. And two, I think our culture, which is has had a positive effect in downplaying and reducing the immediacy with which we go towards violence, and punishing violence, unnecessary violence, pretty harshly. And for the most part, that's a good thing. But I think also that leaves a lot of people not sure what to do with that energy. I think that particularly with men in our culture, there's a lack of of learning the virtue of harnessing that violent tendency towards good. And so we're sometimes, I think, culturally very afraid of any kind of sort of violence, of fighting of any kind, outside of a very, very limited scope. So I think that we're often very discouraged, and sometimes even by the church to rise up and to defend, violently, which again, there is good and virtue in that, but we ought to be at least willing to sacrifice, to give our lives. And
like fighting shouldn't be the first option, but it should be a option.
Right. And inappropriate and prudent in the sense of right action in accord with truth, prudence, using that. Of course, our first reaction is to turn the other cheek, but not when Christ and his church are being attacked and torn down.
Right. It's okay for me to turn my cheek, but it's not okay for me to turn my neighbor's cheek. I need to defend his, but I can be humble for myself, but I need to defend my neighbor. The other thing, a part of the song, one of the lines that it said was, they lived the truths of the past and lived from the world set apart. It's very interesting. Like the world set apart, I don't know what it is in French, but it makes me think of the word like holy, to live holy. And so they kind of stuck to these truths, and kind of how we were talking about earlier, how they kind of stuck to these principles of subsidiarity. They're very like that kind of idea of a small place where Catholics live, and just do normal human things, but with a Catholic perspective on life. It seems like that's kind of what it's drawing from. It's like these people were just good Catholics, living life, tending the farm, raising families, and their world was disrupted by this by wickedness trying to destroy their way of life. And so I just thought that was an interesting line that I had there.
Absolutely, that there's this sense of not throwing out the past, which many of the revolutionaries wanted to. That was their goal, was to throw out whatever was old, because it was all corrupted. And it's the reality is that you can't just throw it all out, and you ought to be able to learn from it and be informed by it, and to take or carry forward in history and in your life that which is lasting and true. Um, and and when you do that, you're able to see the world in a way that's different. You're able to sort of transcend the day to day, just humdrum life that we live, and we're able to perceive the spiritual world, because we can see the action of God in the world over time. So yeah, I definitely think that's a profound, little couple lines.
Mm. Yeah, and then another one is it's kind of interesting, and I don't know how this exactly relates to the War of the Vendée, but I just thought it was interesting that they would include this in their song. It says the enemies of the mass are now trampling reason and right. Like they very specifically mentioned the enemies of the mass, and then they said they trained their arms to defend every truth the church had revealed. So they're not like it's not saying like we were trained to defend the church buildings. We weren't trained to defend our lives. We were trained to defend the truths of the church against the enemies, not of the church, not the enemies of me, my enemies, but the enemies of the mass. I thought it was
Yeah.
very interesting, and I don't know how that, because we didn't really talk about that particularly, but it seemed I was like, it's very interesting that they would target that specifically and say that specifically.
Yeah, because I mean, the French, the so one of the things you mentioned, Our Lady of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. One of the first things they did after beheading the king was turn to relabel that, to wrest that control of it away from the church, and to rename it the Temple to Wisdom, or Temple to Goddess of Truth, or some bollocks like that. Um, but there was this pretty intentional attack, and like I said, if you didn't swear your oath to the state, you weren't allowed to say public masses, you weren't allowed to preach
Mm.
publicly, you weren't allowed to celebrate rites of baptism or weddings, and that kind of thing. And so there was, and then when they closed the churches in 1793, they all the Catholic churches effectively, the people were barred from going to mass. The nobles who had a private chapel and knew a priest, kind of thing, didn't suffer as much from that, but the average people were all of a sudden deprived of the legitimate, need to meet the obligation of mass and their own love and desire of mass. And so they viewed the Republican government as sort of seeking to fight and be
Mm.
enemies of the mass.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because it just kind of it some echoes today where so many people. It seems like there are enemies of the mass today trying to prevent prevent there to be liturgies publicly. And I was very blessed to have not. I didn't get have the. I didn't miss mass at all during Corona because I was assisting my priest for his masses, his private masses, and so I was blessed in that manner. But so many people were deprived of mass for so long, and I can't even
Yeah.
imagine being like. And I know people who are still haven't been back to mass yet. People up north where they're still shut down and they haven't been, and they are saying that they probably won't open up again for a couple months.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the other lines was, and the that they will never prevail. They said they sought to kill our good fathers, our brothers murdered and slain, but they will never prevail as God raises men of His way. And that kind of makes me think of what you were telling me about the slaughtering of them at the end,
Mhm.
and how like even though that they all were slaughtered, it's there is something to it. There's a glorious triumph that's awaiting, not just there, and it's echoing what I thought, what I remember hearing. I think it was Don Juan of Austria who said, "There's no paradise for cowards as they're going off to battle." Like even though like we may have died, we're dying for a noble cause.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And there is an account, obviously probably not entirely factual, but of a priest, before going into those barges that were sunk in the river, talking about, a boy asks the priest, why are the men doing this? And he says, for the same reason it always happens to the cure, men have forgotten God.
Mm.
And yeah, so it's something else.
Yeah, I was visiting the TFP Tradition Family Property Group in Pennsylvania, their headquarters there, and every morning when they process into to breakfast, they chant the Credo, and they chant this song that was written by St. Louis de Montfort called "We Want God," and that just made me think of it because it's just talking about how it says, "We want God, oh men are grateful, we want God." I can't think of the lyrics now, but it's just a beautiful song, and it made me think of that. Sometimes we turn away from God, um, and if we turn away from God, who are we turning to? We're turning towards Satan, and so necessarily, and so yeah, whenever men turn away from God, these kind of monstrosities happen. And it's just very interesting. But any last things that you'd like to mention? Anything that I should have asked you that I didn't? Um,
Like I said, I could talk about the French Revolution for days on end. But I think in our time, the I'd have to say the example in all this is that is fidelity to the church and fidelity to Christ ultimately. And we see a lot of turbulence and unrest in our country today, but know that this too shall pass, and we should encourage our church leaders to lead us well, and pray that there are no columns of hell as the Vendeans had to experience.
mm,
But there is this willingness to fight that I think is commendable, even in the face of almost certain defeat. To stand up and in a noble way defend what matters. Is a powerful example, and there are a number of Vendeans who are listed as Vendean martyrs, who are or even venerated in the Catholic Church, and so I think that's a powerful example, that allowing the faith to be our culture, allowing the faith to be our standard, our flag in battle, and to guide our lives in every aspect of what we do is a powerful example that we don't see very often these days. So
absolutely. Alrighty. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Aquila. I appreciate it. And I'll definitely, while I'm still here for another 20 days or so, I'll maybe I can get you back on and talk about the
yeah.
philosophy of the rights of man versus
Oh yes.
talking about the Declaration of Independence versus Catholic ideas of that. So I think that'll be another interesting thing to explore. But we'll see if I have time to do that in 20 days.
Yeah, I hear you. No, it's a lot. It's a lot to take on, and so.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to I always close out in a Ave at the end of every episode, but before I do that, I just wanted to say, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, soapboxes, negativities, positivities, or anything in between, you can email me at fonsecaproduction@gmail.com. That's Fonseca, FONSECA production@gmail.com for any questions, comments, or concerns, soapboxes, negativities, or positivities. But for the rest, while I'm here, and then we'll close out with a Ave as usual, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tuum mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Santa Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. All you holy Vendée martyrs, pray for us.
Pray for us.
All right, thank you very much. You're
welcome. Thank
you. O Juventutem.
The worst of men are now working to trample scepter and cross, to force upon us foul evils, to bring great ruin and loss. But every age has its warriors, who boldly rise up and say, the blood that flows through my veins bids me fight for virtue this day. But every age has its warriors, who boldly rise up and say, the blood that flows through my veins bids me fight for virtue this day. They heard the voice of the soul calling with each beat of the heart. They live the truths of the past and live from the world set apart. These knights of manly ideals left hearth and home for the field. They trained their arms to defend every truth the church had revealed. These knights of manly ideals left hearth and home for the field. They trained their arms to defend every truth the church had revealed. The enemies of the mass are now trampling reason and right. Vile men spread error, confusion, and doubt all day and all night. They sought to kill our good fathers, our brothers murder and slay. Yet they will never prevail as God raises men of his way. They sought to kill our good fathers, our brothers murder and slay. Yet they will never prevail as God raises men of his way. Of daring crusaders, a glorious triumph awaits. Let nothing stand in your way as you fight to reach heaven's gates. True heirs of daring crusaders, a glorious triumph awaits. Let nothing stand in your way as you fight to reach heaven's gates.